Well, welcome everyone. We are prepared to go here. Welcome with Tivon Feeley, Iowa or DNR Forest Health Specialist for our presentation on ticking time bomb, controlling invasive species. Want to remind you that this is part of our Woodland Legacy series. And if you remember, if some of you were with us earlier this summer, we started things off with Gary Johnson, University of Minnesota, talking about gravel beds and all the really cool uses for gravel beds. And we're actually going to wrap things up with our Woodland Legacy with an event, a planting event. That's going to be out at Jones Park in Cedar Rapids, and that's going to be on October 4th. And so that's going to be a great opportunity to get together and plant some of those seedlings. And then we're going to have a social to follow, just some networking and opportunity to meet and greet, so to speak. So get that on your calendar. That'll be a really fun time. Also wanted to highlight that we have a really fantastic webinar coming up here on the 27th. This is going to be with Phil Kerr. He's going to be talking about the last glacier in Iowa, the Des Moines Lobe. So this is going to be fascinating. Phil has presented with us before, so check out our events page on the website and be sure to get registered for that. It's been a real corker, lots of heat here the last couple of days, but September, I'm guessing things will start to cool down a little bit. And so join us outside for a couple of field days that we have, a walk in the woods and tree planting in Swan Lake State Park near Carroll. That's going to be on the 13th of September. Then we're going to be up in Dickinson County at the Mazer Monarch Lodge with a prairie walk and planting. Then we'll be at Mains Grove Lodge in Franklin County. That's going to be on the 21st. That'll be a fun time. And then Saturday, September 23rd, a prairie planting using hand seeding at Cedar Bluff State Preserve starting at 10 a.m. in Mahaska County. Okay, without further ado, the reason you are all here, let's have Tivon talk to us about ticking time bomb, some of those invasive species.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Like Jeff said, my name is Tivon Feeley, and I'm the Forest Health Program Leader for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. And really, my specialty is diseases of trees, insects of trees, and then non-native invasive plants and forest. And that's kind of what we're going to talk a lot about today, is some of these non-native invasive species. And we're going to break it up into kind of three sections. We're going to talk just briefly about some that we see in prairies and roadways versus some that we might see in urban areas and other types. And then we'll get into all of the management options that are out there and the best way to find the option that fits you. And so we'll go through this. Like Jeff said, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll get to those towards the end of this presentation. So bear with me. All right, the first thing we need to talk about is what is an exotic plant versus an invasive plant. And this gets to be kind of a hot topic depending on where you're at in Iowa. So an exotic means it's not native. It came from another country. We brought it in. We're planting it here in Iowa. We like it because of its ornamental value, or maybe it's got some sort of food value for wildlife. We brought those in. But not all foreign plants are going to be invasive. And I think that's important too. We have a lot of flowers that we might plant around our house that aren't native to the United States, maybe not native to Iowa, and they may or may not be invasive depending on what it is. And we've been fascinated as a human species about taking plants with us, whether we cultivated it for food or just for aesthetics. And this is what we've done for a long time. And that's where a lot of our invasives in Iowa have come from. We brought them in from elsewhere for various reasons. So I think this is a very key point, and it's a little bit of a sticking point for some people, and we're going to just quickly gloss over this. But characteristics of a non-native invasive species is first that it's exotic, okay? It's not from Iowa, or it's not from the United States or America. Something is different about it and it doesn't belong here. It's adaptable to its site, so it can adapt to multiple sites, and they can be very aggressive at colonizing. And you can see that here. This is Japanese knotweed growing in, and it's very adaptable to this site. There's very little soil. Most things want to grow there. You see some native plants in there, but there's also the invasives growing. And they do so well, all of these non-native invasives, because they don't have any natural enemies. There's no native insect or disease that might take them down. Those aren't over here with them. So why is this a little bit of a sticking point? Well, if you go to Western Iowa, I hear people say a lot of times, well, we have this invasive tree called Eastern red cedar. In the forestry world, we don't look at that as an invasive plant. We look at that as a pioneering species. So when you don't have that fire in the prairies or that disturbance, there are certain trees that will come in and pioneer the way to reestablish a forest. And so they're not truly an invasive, although it may come across that way, just because they are native. All right. So invasion of non-native plants in the Midwest. I think a lot of this is kind of understood. These can infest underneath trees if they're shade tolerant, and it could be just the roadways. They have an area that they want to invade into. One of the problems we see very commonly is it increases erosion because there are no native plants that grow underneath it. It can completely hinder your land use. We'll look at some of those things. And it also completely destroys the native biodiversity. You might have other diversity because of all these different plants, but you don't have the native stuff that we need for the wildlife to feed on. So let's jump into the prairie grassland area, roadsides, and I picked 4. And each category I'm picking just a few top species, and there are endless. When I sat down to do this presentation, I could not decide which ones were going to be important. So I just put them in by categories. We'll go through many of these today. But the big thing is at the end when I show you how you can find control for all of them. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the common ones. You've probably heard of leafy spurge, spotted knapweed, Lespenza, wild parsnip. That's a big one in the news now. So let's take a look at these. Leafy spurge, it's native to Europe and Asia and was brought in the 1800s by accident. It's believed that it came in a bed of contaminated oats from Russia, and that's how it got established. But it's a very aggressive plant, and like almost every invasive that I can think of, they thrive in a disturbed area, whether it be disturbed from construction or grazing or something else, even fire. They can do quite well, and that's why some invasive plants do not respond well to fire. It doesn't control them, it ends up spreading them. With leafy spurge, the seeds are viable for 8 years. That's another common theme we see, that the seeds can be around for a long time at invasive plants. The seeds attach to clothing and they can also be carried by wind. This also spreads through its root system through rhizomes, and that's going to be important later when we talk about different control types. If you have an invasive plant that spreads by rhizomes, the root system, it's much harder to control. All right. So why is this one so important? Well, as you can see in the next line there, it causes a lot of irritation to the mouth and digestive tracts of domesticated animals that might feed on it, whether that be cows or even some wild ones. It is not a native plant, and most of them don't realize they should not be eating it. So, and this is a plant that you can see throughout Iowa. It is a beautiful plant. There's another one that we see often, and especially in prairie areas, and this is spotted knapweed. It's kind of fun to see this. There's a little controversy from the people that just love it for its beauty and want it there, even though it's not a native plant, and others who want to burn their prairie as soon as they see it to get it out of there. But it came into the United States in the early 1900s, and it came through contaminated agriculture seed. It's believed it came in on some soy seed that came back into the United States. But it's an aggressive spreader. Once again, does great in disturbed areas, that disturbed overgrazed site, whether you have fire later, whatever it be, that's a quick plant to take over that area. It also spreads through the rhizomes. We do see it transporting in bales of hay, especially during times of drought. The soil's doing pretty poorly and it's sparse from native plants. They can get in there and do quite well. So our domesticated and native wildlife that we have here cannot eat this plant, so it's not going to be one that's grazed. And it really has become a serious problem for parts of Iowa. All right, Chinese Lespenza. Once again, Europe and Asia, we've got kind of a theme here. This is a very aggressive plant. It has root rhizomes that displace the native plants. It's throughout the state of Iowa, but this grass can easily grow, the species can easily grow 3 to 6 feet tall. Very slender stems. And when you look at the midway where the leaves and the branches come out, you'll see them in pairs of 3. and they might have tiny little white flowers at the end. These are interesting winter plants. It looks like they provide a lot of wildlife refuge, if you will, and habitat, and that's why they were left. Unfortunately, they probably should have been controlled as soon as they were found, and they weren't. So this is another one that's displacing all of the natural plants that would grow there. Look at that picture and how dense it is, and think about what could possibly be growing underneath it. In this case, it wouldn't be much at all. And then this one, of course, is the one of nightmares. And if you don't know this plant, you probably should spend some time learning about this plant so you don't accidentally touch this plant. This is wild parsnip. This is a biennial or perennial herb, and it was brought in by early colonists as a root vegetable. The root system has a white growth that you can eat. It is like a parsnip. It looks very similar. However, the plant itself is very dangerous to touch. It's a herbaceous plant that grows about 5 feet tall. You get the beautiful yellow flowers right now, mid-July through August. Beautiful flowers, but if you touch it, that's when you have problems because it causes blistering and burning. It's a phytophotodermis reaction, which means that chemical, when it's in your skin, it absorbs into your skin. Anytime you expose that skin to sunlight, it causes a rash and burning. Unlike poison ivy, if you get that on you, you have a rash, you get the oil off, and if you don't scratch it, you might get rid of it. This will continue to spread with sunlight. And here's a pretty good example of it. In fact, if you look closely, you can see in the bottom arm, the scarring tissue that's raised up, and it's kind of a zigzag pattern, and that's how it starts. When you get into it, it feels like you just burnt yourself, like you burnt yourself on an oven. And then it just keeps moving until you wrap your arm and cover it from sunlight. And then if you have accidental contact, the first thing you should do is wash it, soapy water, get it off your skin, and then cover your skin immediately and keep it covered for a couple weeks so you can take it off in the evening, but prevent the sunlight from getting there, and that'll help prevent this reaction and scarring. So this is a serious plant that we have all over the place. Jumping now from kind of the prairie areas, I wanted to think about the riparian zones. And if you don't know what a riparian zone is, that's the area between the stream and whatever is next, whether it be a house or farm, but that kind of buffer zone. And we have a few serious ones there. I think everybody knows reed canary grass, purple loosestrife's another one, and Japanese knotweed. So we're going to take a look at these. So this is reed canary grass. This was brought in for soil conservation, thinking that, hey, this is going to stabilize the soil. It's got an aggressive deep root system. In addition, it's great for waterfowl nesting, so it was used for habitat early on. But now it dominates everywhere. It propagates so well from seed. It's still used in the livestock industry for forage, but it is a non-native plant that has really taken over and owns a lot of habitat along the streams. Purple loosestrife is another one that's debated because of its beauty, but it was brought in in the mid-1800s, I believe, and it's in all of the United States and Canada now. Its plant height is 2 to 7 feet, has smooth edges, the beautiful purple flowers that we know about. Our biggest populations are along the islands of the Mississippi, believe it or not, and around the edges of the Mississippi River. But we still have it. How did it get in the United States? That's still debated. The best guess, it was an accidental introduction, but there's some evidence it may have been an ornamental planting in the 1800s as well, and nobody really knows on this. We don't have all the records to track it. But this is an invasive plant that's out there. It's been around for a while, and we're going to continue to see this one. You can see why it might have been planted as an ornamental. It is a beautiful plant. It's a single plant that can produce up to 2 million seeds, which is incredible. And that's why they're so prolific. The roots and shoots can also produce new plants by just breaking them off or mowing them down. They do degrade wetlands. They form this whole dense stand that displaces native vegetation, and wildlife just aren't used to the seed and the plant itself. So not many things eat it. So, and the last thing I put on there is kind of a minor one, but it is reported that it does clog a lot of drainage ditches. So an aggressive rooting plant, beautiful plant, but it does have its downfalls. Next one, boy, if you're in Northeast Iowa and you're a trout fisherman, you know this one. This is Japanese knotweed. This has very large, heart-shaped leaves. It's a vine-like vegetation that grows up. It's just a standing shoot. The plants grow so quickly, and they were introduced as an ornamental to a botanical garden before they got out and colonized all the riparian areas. And it's a tough one. If you go out there and you mow it, and those leaves fall into a stream for mowing it, or pieces of the stem, and float downstream and make contact to land, it's going to grow. This is a very aggressive plant. Makes it very difficult to get to that stream if it's there. And they could easily be, 6, 7, 8 feet tall or taller. So this is a plant that we deal with a lot. There was a lot of research done about 10 years back to see, is it better to keep mowing this plant down and deplete its resources, to inject herbicides into the stem of the canes of this plant because they're, kind of thick, or to overspray. And keep in mind, this is a riparian area plant. So the chemicals that you could use, herbicides, are limited to aquatic labeled only. So in the end, the best control method turned out to be injecting into the stems, into those canes, and that's quite expensive and quite timely. So this is a plant that mowing is really the best if you can catch it early and then keep it mowed, but a lot of riparian areas just aren't mowed. So we're going to jump into the area that I'm a lot more comfortable. This is the plant. These are the plants I work with on a daily basis. And these are the forest invasive plants. And there are so many, I didn't even know which ones to put in, but these are the top ones that I see and get the most complaints on. So we have multiflora rose, honeysuckle, buckthorn, garlic mustard, alum olive, kudzu, and orange bittersweet. Multiflora rose. I think everybody knows this one. It was brought in for, believe it or not, conservation and wildlife habitat. At one time, the State Forest Nursery actually grew this plant. We thought it would be a decent one. But it's an aggressive invader of the edges of woodlands. It doesn't like that shaded area so much. You see it in prairies, you can see it in pastures. There was some research that said, hey, this is great because there is a disease, a viral disease called rose rosette's disease that helps control it naturally. We should probably let some more of this virus out. But that impacted a lot of other roses that are planted that are not non-native aggressive species, invasive species. Some of them aren't native, some of them are. And so the release of that disease stopped. And we see this all the time throughout Iowa, common in cattle pastures. And once again, that's because of the disturbance. This one's kind of a debated one too, and we're not the only state that's really fighting the honeysuckles, but Tatarian and Amur honeysuckles are not natives. They're native to Europe and Asia, mainly Asia in this case, but they're deciduous shrubs. They grow quite tall. They can easily get up to 30 feet tall. They have big opposite leaves that are in 2 rows that you can see in the photo there. The fruit is abundant, has the glossy berries that you should not eat, but they become green pink in color. And then they persist into the winter, and then of course they're spread by birds largely, but they can also colonize by root sprouts and other things like that. Extremely shade tolerant. You'll see this on the edges of the forest and even in the forest. So, and our next one, this is also very shade tolerant. This is the buckthorns. If you go out and you look at the end of it, you'll see a single thorn sticking out between those leaves. And it was brought in for cover and also as an ornament. But we see this in forests, pastures, and other open areas. It grows quite quickly. It's a heavy cedar, and the birds love its berries, so they spread it far and wide. However, if you look at it, it's an alternate host for the oak leaf rust disease. So that's very interesting. What that means is for the rust to occur on oats, it needs another plant for part of its life stage. So this plant coming in provided this fungus a chance to complete its life stage and cause a disease on oats, where here on the plant itself, it only causes a little bit of orange spots and lesions. So, and there are a few plants like that in the United States. It's quite interesting. So by bringing in this plant, we created a couple problems, an invasive species issue, plus now we have the oak leaf rust issue. All right, garlic mustard. What a unique plant. And I got to tell you, this is actually one of my favorite invasives to watch because I feel like I could control it if I needed to, but it was brought in. It's a biennial herb or forb, and it is brought in for food purposes. It is garlic mustard. You break the leaf open and it smells a little bit garlicky and it tastes a little bit like mustard. Very common flower that we see all over and plant. Let's go to the next one. Its seed structure, it's kind of interesting. We'll start at the top left. It seeds in midsummer. So right now, those seed pods are ripe, ready to drop. And you can see them out in the forest, and they'll be out there through October. And then seedlings will pop up in early April. However, the first year roses you'll see in the fall. And because you see those rosettes in the fall, it gives them a little bit of a step up over our native plants. They're already rooted and established. They go through winter, they pop back up, and they're ready to grow and outcompete everything. And then you'll go back and see the second year rosettes, and then that one, the heart-shaped leaves, are growing a little bit faster. And then once again, it will flower in May, and then we'll have our seeds again in fall. So this is garlic mustard's life cycle, but its life cycle is different than our natives because it does get established in the fall, not summer, not the next spring. And so it does outcompete a lot of our native plants. The other thing that's unique about garlic mustard is they have an allelopathic effect. Just like black walnut. Black walnut produces a chemical called juglone. I think you're probably familiar with that. It puts it in the soil. And if you have sensitive plants to juglones, they'll die. Tomatoes are often very finicky when it comes down to juglones. Garlic mustard produces another chemical, a different one, that is beneficial to them, but not the native plants in there. And so they thrive in the shady habitat. They grow very well. And like most natives, they keep their leaves on well into the fall. Or not, I mean, most invasives, excuse me. They keep their leaves on well into the fall. And so you can see them. Fall colors over. All our natives have lost their leaves, but garlic mustard, buckthorn, honeysuckle, any of those are still green. And that is a great way to identify them and to help control them. And we'll get into the control part here in just a moment. But like we said, it's a perfect seeder. This is a big one. They collect the seeds in the mud. You'll get them on your boots and carry them from forest to forest. You get them on your fur, or if you're an animal, clothing. It's so easy to transport this plant. So that's garlic mustard. We're going to come back to that one and show you some success stories with it. Kudzu, if you're familiar with kudzu in the southeast, this is probably our most aggressive vine in the United States. You'll see it growing over anything, up telephone poles, anything it can grow, and it's there. You can see these dense mats where nothing grows underneath it. It's a very serious problem. Luckily, it doesn't do great in Iowa. We've only seen it in isolated areas in southern Iowa that we were able to get rid of, but there are populations in southern Illinois. This comes up as a potential concern as we talk about our climate and how things are warming. Is this species going to adapt better to our area? Is it going to take over? Those are questions we don't know yet. I guess we're about to find out. So this was brought in for fodder for cattle to eat and, of course, soil erosion control. And ironically, it ends up causing more erosion. So, all right. Another one you may not know well is autumn olive. We're going to talk about this extensively in the end too. It's a legume. It's a nitrogen fixer. It was introduced to help prevent soil erosion. Great with its fruit for wildlife habitat, but it became a serious invader of the forest edges. And you can see that in those photos. So we'll come back and talk about ways to control this one. But in the wildlife habitat with autumn olive is kind of debated. So, all right, we got an invasive plant. And I think this is the biggest problem that any of us have. At what point is it time to go out and start controlling this plant? And it probably varies a little bit by the plant. So do you go out right away as soon as you see it and get on top of it? Or do you have a threshold that you will allow and you're going to just manage it to keep it underneath that threshold? And so one of the plants I think of right away that I would get rid of as soon as I've seen it and try to control as long as I could would be Oriental bittersweet, because it's such an aggressive vine that grows over everything. If you watch the last seminar, you got to see a lot of it. I do think that is one of the biggest threats to Iowa's forest health, because Oriental bittersweet, that vine will grow on plants, shade them out, and they don't care what tree species it is. So if we look at Dutch elm disease, that's disease that's specific to elms. Emerald ash borer to ash. These vines, they don't care. They'll grow on whatever they can. So I would get rid of that, but I do think that garlic mustard is a good example. I can tolerate some of that. I have a little bit of a threshold that I don't want to see it go over. And if it does, then I'm going to go out and try to take care of it. So you have to go out, survey your site, know what plants you have out there. It doesn't hurt to have a management plan from district forester or others if you're out there. And then the timing of spraying it or burning it or whatever your management option is crucial because it does vary by plant. So, and if you can do anything that's multi-management, whether it be chemicals, burning, biological control, hand pulling, that's great. The more different methods you have, the greater success of control you'll have. And the hard part is the follow-up. You know, once you've done it once, you're not so excited to go out and do it again, but you do need to keep monitoring and go out and follow up with them. So here's a part of a presentation I was doing for Iowa State University on their pesticide certification one, and we're looking at autumn olive, black locust, and tree of heaven. And how can we control these trees that are growing off-site? We don't want them here. They're not native. They're invasive plants. And they're very similar in the control types. And so let's look at our non-chemical controls. Our first one is mowing. That's pretty simple and straightforward. If you have young trees that you can get a mower over and you mow over them repeatedly, you're going to deplete their nutrients and get rid of them. So it works moderately well, but only on young trees. And you have to completely deplete those nutrients, which means mowing repeatedly, and that may not be something feasible depending where you're at. Next option would be looking at prescribed fire. Well, on these three species, it needs a very, very hot burn to really kill them back. In most cases, you're not going to get a hot burn in a forest. You might in a prairie, but not in a forest. So you're not going to see control in a forest area with a spring burn or a low fuel load burn. So a low fuel load burn would just cause it to resprout from the roots and from the stem, and you'll have a bigger problem than you started with. So prescribed fire on these three, I would say, is probably out. The next one I've got a picture of on the bottom right, and that's double girdling. All right, we're going to go out with a chainsaw, a hatchet, something. We're going to take that bark off in two areas around the tree. We're going to girdle it twice. Well, a lot of these trees are so adaptive that they're just going to sprout below the girdle and continue to live and use that existing root system that's alive to feed it. And they'll grow just as well, if not even faster than they did before. So I think double girdling for these three are out. Then our next option's the most expensive option, and that's going out, cutting the tree down, grinding out the stump and as much of the root system as you can, and getting it off the site. Okay, works well in urban areas. I might do something like that in my backyard, but you can't really do that in riparian areas, prairies, woodland settings, not so easily. And it is quite pricey. So what are some other options? Well, unfortunately for some, and it's just a reality, sometimes you have to go to the chemical one and look at the chemical options that are out there. There's different ways to treat them. We could use foliar sprays, which is exactly what it sounds like. I'm going out with maybe a backpack sprayer, and I'm going to spray just the leaves of these young tree seedlings and see if we can get rid of them. Works great on young trees, but it's kind of like that mowing. You got to go out and you got to get it repeatedly, and you got to get the top of the tree. And so if you have a large tree, foliar sprays probably aren't going to work real well. The next is stump cutting. This is the second most expensive, very laborious, but it's when you cut the tree down and you treat the stump. We're going to show you some of those pictures coming up, but it does work extremely well, but you do have to cut the tree. And so when you're looking at massive amount of trees, this may not be the best option. The next is the hack and squirt method. It's where you go out with a hatchet, you hack out part of the bark, you frill around it, and you put some sort of chemical in there. These trees here, for these species, that's a very low success rate, because just like when we girdled it before, or we talked about it in the last slide, they're just going to sprout below that chemical area. And you're going to get a lot of these sprouts. You might get moderate kill from the chemicals, but there's just not enough herbicide in that tree to completely kill it, especially the root system, and you'll see them survive. And the last one, basal bark, tends to be my personal favorite. When you've got a lot of trees to control that don't belong there, or a lot of invasive plants, you can spray just the vine. You can spray just the bark of the tree. And that's the basal bark method. It's probably one of the more cost-effective options, but you do need a dye and something, a surfactant in there that helps carry that chemical into the tree. But a very high success rate for this. So, and I write down here, when we get into the chemicals, always follow the label and wear protective gear. Okay. All right. So I'm going to use a 4-star rating method, and I'm going to show you a website here at the end of this presentation where you could type in any non-native invasive plant and you will get all of the recommendations to control that plant. And you can figure out if that success rate's enough for you, or if you want something else, if burning is going to be an option, or if hand pulling is an option, or it'll list them all out on this 4-star rating. So we're going to continue with our 3 tree species, right? And we looked at glyphosate in some of these studies, and we used a 20% rate, and we had only moderate control, about 50% control. A lot of them, especially Tree of Heaven, they're very good about walling off that herbicide once it's inside the tree, and then the root system remains. And so glyphosate did not work very well. So this is on the foliar spray. So then we went into Trifle Clear, sprayed them with that, and we saw a little bit better kill rate at the 20% rate. And I would say Mount Dead, we probably saw in that 70 to 80%, so pretty good control with foliar sprays with Trifle Clear. Mazapure, yeah, it's kind of like glyphosate. Glyphosate's also Roundup, not the best control on them. And remember, these are very hard to control. When you're out spraying these over the foliage of a plant, you're going to hit some non-target species. You might hit some native forbs underneath. You might hit another native tree and kill it. And so you also have to kind of weigh that in, depending on how sensitive your site is, as if I'm going to use a spray control, am I going to hit something that I don't want to? Is that going to impact it as well? So, and I think that's one of the benefits of the basal bark method, is it's isolated to a tree. This is the cut stump method. Remember, we're still looking at just our 3 species as a comparison. And we tried the 3 again. We cut the tree down. You can see we used a little bit of dye so we could see how far behind the bark we are. We tried glyphosate, we tried Trifle Clear, and we tried imazapyr, and we got great kill on the trunk. There's not much trunk left, and the root system as well. Remember, there's only about 3 to 4 inches behind the bark of the tree that's actually living, and that's all you need to treat. You don't need to spray down the whole stem that's cut. And that's why we use the dye, so you can see what we're looking at. That's the area that we would want to treat. Now, if you look at the asterisks on my slide, I say do not use Tordon RTU because Tordon is known for its flashbacks. What does that mean? Well, Tordon is a great killer of trees and a good herbicide, and it gets in that root system, and it was really made so when it leaches out of the root system, if there was a root still alive, it would flash back and kill it and prevent that tree from resprouting and growing. However, Tordon lasts quite a few years in the soil, and what we found out through the years is if there's another plant that's sharing that space near that root system of the tree that was injected or treated with Tordon, it could flash back and kill those trees. And you could kill a lot of non-target species. So although this is probably the most common in garden stores, maybe some of the most affordable, I'm not sure that this herbicide is the best for control. All right, here's our hack and squirt method. Literally just using a spray bottle, going out with a hatchet. We did glyphosate. Now, glyphosate here is at a 50% rate. So we had it a lot more concentrated. And we tried Trifle Clear and imazapyr, and you can see that glyphosate gave us the better control. And it works well on Tree of Heaven, on Autumn Olive, but on Black Locust, there's such a good root sprouter, it had very little control. So there was a little bit of a difference when we did field tests on them, but not a lot. So, all right. Now we're on to my favorite. And if you've listened to my presentations, you'll understand why again and again. I really like the basal bark control because I can go out there any time of the year. I don't care if it's fall, spring, summer. or even the winter months, if I can get coverage on that stem of the tree, it will absorb in and kill that tree or that vine or that invasive plant. And really what I'm doing is I'm going out there and spraying 12 to 18 inches of the bark with whatever chemical, whatever rate we have above. I always use a dye so I can see that what I have sprayed, and I have to be very, very careful not to let it spray past that vine or past that tree onto another plant, because I don't want to inadvertently kill something. So we got our chemical, we got our dye, I'm ready to go out, but I also need a surfactant. The surfactant is something that allows the chemical to absorb through that bark better. There are different ones on the label depending on which chemical you use, which herbicide. The common ones are diesel, kerosene, sometimes crop oils or basal bark oils. Examples of basal bark oils are Exit and Axit. I've got those listed. Those are good for environmentally sensitive areas. They don't have a lot of negative impacts to the environment. There's no residue left over. They just allow the chemical to absorb into the tree, but they're quite pricey. So when we did our research at Backbone State Park and a couple other parks on this, we tried all of these, and in the end, diesel turned out to be the most affordable and had the most success for us. It got that chemical through the bark and into the tree, and we had about a 95 to 98% kill rate on everything we tried, and I think that's pretty amazing. So trifaclor was a chemical we used in that study. Mazapur does quite well as well, but glyphosate fell down to 1. It does not absorb well through bark. It works well if the bark is green and it's a young tree and it's still, because bark can photosynthesize a little bit like a leaf will when it's still green. If you see it at that stage, that star rating will move up, but when the bark is formed and it doesn't have that green color, that rating will drop down to 1, maybe even lower, depending on what species we're looking at. All right, so we want to look at other things. Let's get more holistic here. I don't want just chemicals. I don't want just this. So what can we do? Well, goat grazing in Iowa has become huge, and rightly so. I like this livestock grazing. What happens is they take these goats and they feed them a select diet, and now the goats favor that diet. So let's say I want to control garlic mustard and Oriental bittersweet. That's what they're fed. An area of your forest is fenced in, and the goats are allowed to go roam and feed like they do, and then they first pick on the invasive plants that they've been trained to eat from, and that's what they're going to eat. And I think that's quite incredible, and I think it is a great option to add to your control. Obviously, it works better with some plants than others, but they really help deplete. It's like getting your lawnmower out there to deplete the plant's nutrients, but it's goats. I don't think you can get a whole lot more natural than that. Some of the drawbacks are you can only do small patches at a time. You've got to let them completely deplete that, then they move the fence and move the goats. But I really see a lot of merit here, and I can think of 2 or 3 companies off the top of my head right now that do this, and I'm sure there are more out there. But definitely something I'd look at, especially if I'll pick an Oriental bittersweet, if you're in an area where there's just so much in your forest that there's no way to spray it, you would go after the big vines with spray and then follow up with the goats on the sprouts that are coming up. The next one is mechanical, whether it be lawn mowing or manual by pulling it out. And those work well on some things. Garlic mustard, hand pulling it early works pretty well, but it can be quite overwhelming. And the last one is prescribed fire, but you have to have the right fuel load. And so we mentioned this earlier. Garlic mustard, I love it with the spring burn. We're going to look at that next. And the success rate we get, you can get a nice hot fire in a prairie fire like you see in the bottom, but is it going to be long enough to kill some of these trees like Tree of Heaven? And that varies. You have to have a hot, slow fire to get some of those. So each one will differ. At the beginning of the presentation, I started pointing out plants that had rhizomes. Prescribed fire is not going to kill the ones with rhizomes. Yeah, that rhizome is going to live underneath ground. It's buffered from the fire, and they're just going to resprout. In fact, the fire could make it a little bit worse. So let's take a look real quick at garlic mustard as we kind of cycle down to the question and answer point soon. So this is at Backbone State Park. You can see the dense understory of garlic mustard everywhere. And we decided to write a grant with the U.S. Forest Service, and I wanted to know what is the best method. So we got a bunch of Boy Scout troops and Girl Scouts that came out, and they hand pulled this, believe it or not. They did 25 acres of hand pulling 2 times a year for 3 years. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. And then we looked at the difference of that versus using glyphosate. We used specifically aquatic labeled, so rodeo in our case, and then doing foliar sprays. And then we also looked at fire on garlic mustard to see what it did, burning roughly 220 acres. And this is what we found. Fire did great. In this picture, you'll notice on the edge, this is on the edge where we burned, this is multiflora rose that was doing great there, and now it's dead from our spring burn. Spring burn is going to be the key here. It carried a low, slow, but consistent fire, not hot enough to damage our native trees, but just hot enough that these invasives didn't do well. And garlic mustard was horrible. And if you remember when we talked about garlic mustard earlier, you see it start in the fall. Here we are in spring, and there's nothing after our burn. We got a good toasting on it, if you will. The hard part is making sure you have just enough fuel load to keep the fire sustained in the forest. But 17 days after the burn, we start seeing all of these native forbs coming back that we hadn't seen for a long time. There was jack in the pulpit, yellow bellwort, all kinds of stuff that had just disappeared from that forest because garlic mustard owned that site, but the seed was still viable. And that's the good news, is the seed is still viable on a lot of our native plants as well, or it'll come in over time. And so this grant has continued, and we have now burnt the same 220 acres a total of 5 times at Backbone State Park and a few other parks. And this is what it looks like today. You can see through the forest. You have, if you look in that understory, you have some oak regenerating. You have some maple regenerating. You have native forbs everywhere. And this became the best control option at the end of our study, was prescribed fire for garlic mustard. And I would recommend this for anyone. There's a lot of questions going on now in the plant world. Did this fire change garlic mustard's allelopathic effect, which is that chemical poisoning of the soil effect that helps it survive? Did it break it down and make it where it wasn't a useful chemical anymore? Something happened, because we don't see garlic mustard resprouting. In fact, I didn't put it in here. I probably should have. If I turned around and looked on the other side, we're standing at the edge of a road, it's a carpet of garlic mustard. So if you go to these research plots, you'll see on one side, which is the west side of the road, clear, just like this. Beautiful forest you can walk through. You look at the east side of the road, and it's a carpet of garlic mustard, oriented bittersweet, things like that. What we did learn in this one is fire worked well for garlic mustard, horrible for oriented bittersweet. It did resprout. So those we went through and touched up with chemicals. But so each plant has its own necessary requirements to control it. And as a landowner, where do you start? I start here. This is the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and I'll drop this in chat. This is their control database, which allows you to go down and you can search by common name. You can type in whatever non-native invasive plant you want by common name, scientific name, and it will list every control option out there on a 4-star rating like we just looked at. You know, for that specific plant, is fire the best? Is hand pulling the best? Is mowing the best? You can look at all of it. Chemical control, all of it's there. So let's say you go through it, you picked out your plant. We're going to pick an oriented bittersweet again. So we type it in there. It comes up with your rating, and you decide that I want that 4-star control. I want the best control, and I'm going to go for chemicals. Okay. How do you know which chemical to use? That's this next one. This is greenbook.net. You can type in whatever plant you want to control, and it will show you all of the chemicals that have that plant listed on their label to be controlled with. A very great resource. Then you can look at the ins and outs, because on this site, it'll have the label of every one of these chemicals. So you can see what's needed for your protective gear, what the potential environmental impacts are, you know, if you need a surfactant or not, all of that will be listed here. And I think between these two sites, these are the best resources. And I can't stress it enough. I mean, we got to go back to that threshold and knowing when you need to start treating and not. The best way to do that is to have a management plan developed for your site and getting a hold of a consulting forester or a district forester that does that. So with that, we're going to kind of wind down a little bit earlier than I expected, but we can tackle some of these questions. This is my name and phone number. That is my cell phone number. And if you have trouble, we can get text messages on that. One thing I didn't mention in here, there is an app that you can put on your phone that's called Picture This or Picture It. I have to look again. But it allows you to take a photograph in the field of a plant and it will tell you exactly what it is. So if you're not sure exactly what invasive you're at, that's a great app to help identify it. Our website here, iowdnr.gov/invasives, also has a lot of the most common ones and ways that you can report it. So with that, we're going to go back to Jeff and start taking questions, and I'll drop a couple of these in the link here.
And we have all sorts of questions here. So let me start with the first one. Hey, Tivon, with basal bark treatment, how much surfactant is added to the spray mix?
So that varies a lot, and it really depends on the chemical, because each chemical is going to have a different labeled amount and which surfactant you're using. So I'd say an average of between 3 and 7% surfactant. It could be as much as 10% if you're in the accent, more of the biodegradable organic ones, but it varies quite a bit. So on all of these things, when you go to that greenbook.net, find your label, say I'm going to pick Trifle Clear, I'm going to use a surfactant, it'll list, diesel fuel, this rate, kerosene, this rate, biodegradable surfactants, this rate. Make sure you follow the label on all of them.
Excellent. So Tivon, we live in a residential area. Since the derecho, we have lots of horseweed. Could you comment on this weed and best control method?
So horseweed, I don't know as well as some of the forest ones. So I will just tell you with my limited experience that if you're able to mow it, it's one that can be mowed down pretty easily. If not, then you're going to have to look for more of a broadleaf chemical. And to find out which one best suits you, I would go to greenbook.net, type in horseweed, and see what pops up, and then pick one from there. The hard part is the common chemicals I can think of that people are going to recommend would be like glyphosate or Roundup, but then you're going to kill any grass below it too, so or whatever you're trying to grow. So it's a little bit of a challenge.
Okay. So 2.5 acres of woods behind the house, full of invasives, especially honeysuckle, multiflora rose, small amounts of autumn olive, barberry. Husband and I worked very hard this spring to get rid of these larger plants, but now seeing some vining species, a little bit unfamiliar with. One looks like wild yam, but could it be invasive Chinese yam?
It could be. When you have a nice plot of land like that, I think it really is beneficial to have a consulting forester come out, district forester or consulting forester. I know that consulting foresters have a fee, but it's not a terrible high fee, and they come out and they'll assess the land and tell you everything you've got there and come up with a management plan, including some of these chemicals that you could use, fire if it's allowed in that area. But there's no way to know, but some of these species you're mentioning, I think of them because we mentioned that they're so green well into fall when everything else is dormant. I think of buckthorn and Polk County Conservation. They go out and they spray glyphosate through the forest. They fog it, if you will, because all of our native plants are dormant, and it has no impact on the native plants there, because the only thing that's green and respiring and going to absorb that glyphosate would be the invasive. So that could be a control, but you'd have to find out what the price is depending on how many plants you have, and it is a great control. But in fact, the reason I like it is I can go through and do that maybe a couple of years, wait 3 or 4 as those die, and that's my fuel load if I'm in the traditional forest. I know in an urban setting it'll be tough, but that's my fuel load for a nice spring burn.
Okay. Someone read that bush honeysuckle has allelopathic qualities. Is this the case?
So it does, and there's many plants that do. It's just not a strong allelopathic effect. Garlic mustard's pretty strong. We mentioned walnut is very strong. Honeysuckle, not so much. So I always, when I teach master gardeners and stuff like that, I always use this as an example. If you want to see how strong the allelopathic effect is, go out and buy the cheapest tomato and plant a tomato plant in that shared root system, and it will be dead in a few weeks with black walnut because it's such a strong effect. When you get into garlic mustard, it really won't be dead. It just won't grow well. The leaves will become deformed. It won't produce fruit. It doesn't really get high. So if you do the same thing with honeysuckle, you're going to see the same thing. It's going to be more of a deformed, not growing as well. So it's not a strong toxicity, but it is there.
Great. Hey, Tivon, are you aware of any efforts to quote unquote train native insects to feed off of some of the invasive plants that are a problem?
I wish. There isn't. I don't think we can train an insect, but we do spend a lot of time, and I'm using the royal we, all of my counterparts and different agencies as well in different states, looking at different biocontrol. And I'm going to pick on garlic mustard again because this had been the biggest and most debated biocontrol I've ever seen. So there are a couple insects, there's a beetle and a weevil that could be released that attack the plant. They're not native, okay? And so it goes through this process called a tag process, and all the states review it. They do an environmental assessment. If this insect is released and it starts attacking garlic mustard, what else could it attack that's native? And it goes through this huge process, and finally everybody comes back, and the Canadians as well, and say, we're fine, I don't see any issue there. There was a state that was a little bit of a holdup. And then Central and South America came back and said, nah, we're not such a big fan of it for a little bit. But now everybody's on board. This is an option. It's not been released, but that process is there. And that's something that's always being looked at. But just because I'm a forest health forester, I've always got a little bit of in me that's leery of these biocontrols, because could they jump to something else we wouldn't expect, even if we study it? They are so well studied before the release. I don't think that'll happen, but that's always a risk.
Here's an interesting question here. Used imazapyr, and it didn't mix with diesel. So what products what might be able to be mixed with imazapyr?
Accent. If you're looking for a surfactant and imazapyr, that combination is great, but Accent is pretty expensive. I'm just gonna. So diesel, what is diesel a gallon? Now I didn't see today's prices, but what are we talking? Maybe $4 a gallon.
Maybe $4, yeah.
Accent's going to run you close to $50 a gallon. So it is a significant difference, but it works very well with it.
Excellent. Do you know of a chemical product that would kill wild parsnip in CRP, but maybe have minimal effect on the forbs? Is that even in existence?
So I haven't searched greenbook.net, and trust me, I'm going to. My wife and I were out mowing our lawn the other day, and I saw parsnip, and I don't know how. I'm the one that mowed it down, and I do think mowing's the best. Repeatedly mowing this plant will deplete its nutrients, and it will not come back. So that would be my preferred method. But somehow she got the oil residue on the other side of the yard on her, and she's got her scarring on her arm that will be there forever. She got about 5 large of those kind of lightning zigzags, and it was funny, just like I said, that night she's like, wow, it feels like I burnt my arm on the side of the oven, but I didn't touch it. And then by that night, those zigzags developed. I knew right away what it was. So we covered it and stopped it from spreading. I don't know of any chemical without going to Green Book myself, but it's something I'm going to have to look for, even in my yard, just to get rid of that little patch that showed up. And the only reason I have it here is it's doing great with this ongoing drought that Iowa has been in. It is taking advantage of it.
Yeah.
So I would suggest check greenbook.net. I don't know of one yet that will kill just it and not others, but I'm going to have to research it myself.
So if you're removing large areas of invasives, either chemically or mechanically, is there a recommended species to plant in its place, or what do you do after you do that treatment to get rid of it?
So that's a tough one. So it depends. That picture with garlic mustard, all the native plants came back. I didn't have to do anything. However, if we're getting rid of buckthorn and honeysuckle and tree of heaven or whatever, and they've shaded out that site forever and there's nothing else there, then you probably will have to replant some seedlings or direct seed, which is just taking seed that's viable from trees and other plants and spreading it through the forest. That way you don't have to worry about the deer. It's going to overwhelm the deer browse. They might eat a few of them, but you're going to have some that still live. there's more heartache when you plant a seedling and you come back and the deer has eaten it. So you may very well have to replant. It really depends on what plant and how much damage it's done and how long it's been there. If it's been there for 8 years or more, most native seeds are not going to come back. Only through natural spread. It won't be viable in the soil.
Got it. Okay. Are you familiar with a community or co-op of landowners, municipalities, religious organizations that can lean into each other for information, labor, equipment, etc.? What are some good sources of info?
So unfortunately, a lot of these are falling apart right now, but cooperative weed management associations tend to be the best. And there is one in the Cedar Rapids area, the Hawkeye Cooperative Weed Management Association, and they do a great job. I don't know about equipment loaning, but they've got an excellent amount of publications, wealth of knowledge, field days that they do all the time. But a lot of them, including like the one here in Des Moines, it was in Indianola, they closed down a couple of years ago. There's just not a lot of funding for these things, and that's the tough part. There are cost share programs that can help if you have a traditional woodland, but I don't know of anybody that does equipment loaning, and I wish there were.
Great question. Let's see here. Get your questions in now, folks, as we move down the line here. Resident
example, if I can, Jeff. And if she's on here, forgive me, I can't remember her name for the life of me right now, but there's a lady in the Cedar Rapids area that Mark Vitas, the district forester, and I went to visit, and she was full-time managing Oriental Bittersweet. She had a couple consulting foresters there all the time, and amazing job controlling it, but she can never stop because none of her neighbors are controlling it. And that's one of the hard parts of this effort. You know, without everybody cooperating together to try to reduce the population of it, it just keeps moving in. And that was one of her big issues. And I see that everywhere. You know, if I wanted, I'll pick on backbone, if I wanted to control it 100% in backbone and have it restored as much as I can to how it looked before, all the neighbors have to do the same thing because it's just going to migrate right back in. And that's a challenge.
Hey, this goes back to that other question you mentioned with the seedlings or direct seeding. So when you do successfully remove invasives, is it more likely for other invasives to fill that open space, or will the natives utilize the area?
That's a great question. If the seed bank has been depleted from the invasives, or you've been able to control it long enough, then the natives should thrive and do quite well. And you're just going to have that threshold we talked about earlier. And that threshold is something you're going to have to define. Like, how many invasives am I comfortable with before it starts impacting something? And it depends on your management plan, but you'll set that threshold. And when you start seeing them creeping up, then you'll go back in and manage them again.
Excellent. Just want to get that captured. Okay. Let's see here. Todd wants to know the name of the Cedar Rapids organization. That was the Hawkeye Weed Management, I believe it was. Yep. Hawkeye Weed Management. And I'll try to include a link, Todd, with that in the follow-up email. Would you clean diesel out of your sprayer? I have a lot of black locust to spray, so I plan to use a 30-gallon tow-behind spreader. Oh, wow. Okay.
Ooh. Okay, so would I clean diesel out? Is that what I heard?
How? Just rinse it out? Is that sufficient? Or?
So that's the issue, is how. So I don't do a lot of tow behinds. We did have a contractor that did that with an ATV. Most everything I do is a backpack sprayer, and then I'll have it committed as the diesel blend because of that issue. Is it will absorb in. But following the label, you're never going to get the diesel out. I'll tell you that up front. But following the label, triple washing everything out, triple rinsing, will reduce it down to a non-harmful level. But there'll always be that little oily residue in there, and I think that's what the person's worried about. We can get the chemical out a lot easier. It's that residue that's going to be there for a while.
Yeah.
You got to remember, you have to agitate often when you use a surfactant to keep it mixed.
Oh, residential area, we have lots of black locust, but arborists suggest not to cut down the section in our yard. Why?
The reason they don't want you to cut it is you have to kill them before you cut it. If you just cut them, they're just going to resprout, and you're going to have a bigger problem than you have currently. They are such an aggressive rooter. So you could do basal bark, you could cut and then treat the stump, but if you don't go to that next step, it was for nothing. They're just going to come right back and you'll have a lot more of them. I suspect that's why they're advising against it.
So just the proper order: kill it, then cut it. Could you go into the more detail about the relative nature of Tree of Heaven and why it's important to tackle it right away to get on top of it?
So Tree of Heaven's that species that's going to step in that spotlight pretty soon. Not native. If you've ever read the book A Tree That Grows in Brooklyn, a tree that grows in the middle of Brooklyn, in the middle of that concrete, that's Tree of Heaven. That's what the book is about. And okay, in Brooklyn, it's your only shade. Maybe it is something that's amazing, but here it's a very aggressive species that doesn't belong in the United States. And it is the habitat that's required for an insect called spotted lanternfly that we've been watching out east move closer towards us. And if you don't know what spotted lanternfly is, I think we talked about it in my last presentation. You can get on the internet, search it, but it's a non-native insect that's going to be a nuisance for us that we're going to have to learn to live with. Emerald ash borer, here for life. Spotted lanternfly, when it does get here, it's going to be around forever. But it needs to be successful and keep high populations. It needs Tree of Heaven. So what we've been looking at as a state, and other states are doing the same, if we could start eradicating Tree of Heaven and bring those populations down, that should also equate to spotted lanternfly populations go down. But it's amazing how much Tree of Heaven we have in the state of Iowa, especially in urban areas. And it's going to take a concerted effort to go out there to treat these and get them out and keep them out. But it will have a positive impact if we can do that. And that's why Tree of Heaven's really become more important to start controlling now. For years, we're like, well, we'll just leave it. Unless it's in my yard, I want it out. But anywhere else, it's there. Well, now I think we're going to have an effort to get rid of it as much as we can.
Thank you for that detailed explanation. I think that's exactly what they were looking for. A few more to wrap up. Recommendation to help control Oriental bittersweet in the infancy stage.
I cannot express this enough, and I have such joy saying this. I love the goats. The goat grazing in that infancy stage, just the nature of a goat, and I'm not a goat expert by any means, and they can explain it, the goat owners, better than I can, but they like to not just grab the plant, they grab the root system with it when they pull it. And if you know Oriental bittersweet, they have that very long root system. They're not going to let it go. Goats are very greedy with their food, it seems like, and they want all of it. And so they're very thorough about depleting that plant early. And that is one of my favorite items to use for early control, or if I've gone in and I've done basal bark spraying and I've got everything knocked back and we got sprouts, I bring in the goats. Can you go to herbicide? You absolutely can. Roundup foliar spray works well. When it's young, you can do that as well, but then you hit non-targets. When I bring in these goats, they've been fed specifically Oriental bittersweet and a few others, and they go to town. And it is kind of fun to watch, to be honest.
Okay, few spots of Japanese knotweed. Is digging this out now effective?
I'm going to assume that you're saying digging it out with a shovel, not with a backhoe. We've tried so much. Yellow River State Forest was a research plot we tried it on. So if you're familiar with that state forest, you know where it's at, because if you're a trout fisherman, you cannot get close to the stream in certain areas. Going through and depleting the canes by mowing, if you get it before it's taller than you are, so you can mow it, is really the best thing you can do. I know there's a chance that you're going to have some leaves blow off from the mower into the water and spread it. That's going to happen. I would say aim everything away from the water if you can, but depleting it works quite well. If not, the cane injections, and there is an injection system. It looks like a little gun with a needle on it. We inject just a little bit of rodeo in it. It works quite well. It's just very tedious, but it kills the plant and the root system. And the benefit is they tend to root graft below ground and share that root system. When that happens, that chemical moves from one to another. So if you missed one, there's a chance you'll get it just because of the shared root system. So those are the two management plans I really recommend. I think mowing actually is supreme on this one if you can get in there early.
Okay, two more. How do you treat Tree of Heaven in residential areas then?
Okay, in residential areas, this gets to be tough. First of all, you have to be the owner of the tree to treat it. Okay. If you're not the owner of the tree and it's on city property, then you can't. You have to work with the city to see what they want to do. In urban areas, because I don't want a tree that I'm spraying with basal bark spray that's going to die and fall apart and potentially hit something, because we have targets in urban areas. I prefer cutting the tree down and spraying that 3 to 4 inches behind the bark and getting killed that way. And that's how I would manage it in an urban area.
So cut the tree and then the stem, treat the stem.
That cut stump method that we talked about, treat that
Yep.
stem
Okay.
3 to 4 inches behind. I think that's preferred. Otherwise, you're going to have a standing dead tree that could fall and break and hit something. You know, in the woodlands, we don't care about that so much. That becomes wildlife habitat. But in urban areas, that could be an extreme issue. So that's a great question.
Okay, got that captured. Is there a way to find a consulting forester in the state of Iowa, Tivon?
There is. If you go to Iowa State Extension Forestry's website, I don't have that one open, otherwise I drop it in the links. They do have a list of consulting foresters within the state of Iowa. So if you're looking at a small woodlot, you want something done at that smaller level, that's the way to go. Let's say you own, I have 200 acres of trees or whatever it may be, that's much bigger. You can use a consulting forester, or you can also have a district forester come out and assess those and write up management plans. District foresters are available on the DNR website. You go into the iowadnr.gov and type in district forester or private lands forester, and they will come up. And that's what they do. They assist people on their private property.
Okay. And then, since derecho, we have a vine that is covering everything in our woods. Not sure what it is. Maybe morning glory. Took a picture, but we don't have the picture. But that's all right. What's out there right now in the derecho areas that you've maybe seen?
Everything. There is a little bit of everything. So I'm opening this on my phone. So give me 1 second. This is that app I mentioned. It's called Picture This.
Picture this.
You can download this. I think you get to use a few tries for free, but then there's a subscription fee. But I just literally take a picture of the plant, and it is very, very accurate. I'm so impressed with this app that it will identify it. You can also text me a photo of it. My phone number was on that last slide. That is my cell phone. You can snap a picture of it, text it, and I'll tell you what I think it is. And then that'll allow you to use these other resources. But since the derecho, it's such a big area of the state that's been hit, I've seen anything from some plants that we didn't talk about, like Japanese hops in parts of central to west central Iowa, then to the east or into bittersweet, like everything in between that you can think of growing. I don't know that there's anything that I could say is the one. There's a lot of wild cucumber that kind of took advantage of it. So I'm not sure what vine it is, but I would try one of those. The thing that surprised me most about derecho, and I was quite pleased with it, it was late enough in August that we didn't see a lot of oak wilt transmission. If it had been a month or two earlier, I think we would see a lot of oaks that were slightly damaged and a high increase in oak wilt mortality. But we have not recorded that yet, so that's good. But we do see a lot of invasive plants, unfortunately.
Just a couple of points to follow up with what you just said. Carrie mentioned Picture This can be used free indefinitely. Just tap the very faint cancel in the upper right-hand corner when you open the app, and you should be able to utilize it. And then Taylor mentions another option is something called Seek, S-E-E-K, which is powered by iNaturalist. And then certainly iNaturalist is a really popular app as well to take photos and stuff. But
well, thanks, Ted. I'm going to try that one myself to see what I think too.
And Jeff just panned in here. PlantNet is another app. PlantNet. So hey, a couple to try out. One last question because it had to do with goats, and this one intrigued me actually. So would a controlled burn after allowing goat grazing be a wise strategy for well-established invasives?
So yes, but I would like to reverse the order.
Ah.
So I would burn first, and you're going to get a lot of plants that sprout, and especially the invasives, and then goat graze, because the goats are going to go in there and deplete that plant right away because they're going to pull it out. And then you're going to get a much better control than if you bring in goats first and then burn.
Gotcha.
So,
and of course, burn's going to require a load, so you have to have that, right?
Yep. Just like we said in that presentation, invasive plants love disturbance, and that fire is going to be that disturbance. It will kill some and it will help others take off, but those goats can finish those others that start to take off.
Excellent. Hey, folks, I really want to thank you for joining us here today. And Tivon, a great big round of applause for sure. We had over 100 folks that chimed in here. We've got some really great questions asked. A reminder, this recorded presentation will be put up on our YouTube page. For everybody that registered, we'll send out a link when it gets posted, and we'll try to include some of these other links that Tivon had from the greenbook.net to the Seek and some of these other apps and stuff like that, so that you can all have access to it. Thanks, folks, and hey, have a great day, great week, and stay cool.
Thanks, everyone.